Okay, got it.
True. I didn't get a notification, but it seems to say that we're recording anyway.
Okay,
Or
perfect.
how to stop a recording.
Okay, perfect. Well, just before you start, okay, let's do this. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of 1+1, your place for inconvenient truth-telling and myth-busting. Joining me today in a series of possibly 3 interviews, all connected, but so this is going to be part 1. Joining me today in another one of our all things Eastern European history and current affairs, and to talk specifically about the once united country of Yugoslavia, is our returning champion, Ivan Stoiljkovic. Did I say your name? Did I say your last name correctly, or did I butcher it?
It's getting better. Stoiljkovic.
All right, I'll take that for a win. Who is a Yugoslav immigrant who is based in Canada, and he is our guest. And last year we had Ivan. Ivan was a mayoral candidate of a part of Ontario. And Ivan, I believe you came in 3rd place during that mayoral race, right?
In Kingston, Ontario, yeah.
Fantastic. And yes, and Ivan is he's a leftist activist. He's a working class hero, a man of various trades. But you're currently a music teacher, right? Or specifically a violin teacher, or music in general?
Yeah, violin.
Fantastic.
Yeah, also a bus driver, Kingston Transit bus driver.
Brilliant. And yes, and so he does all of that, but today he is our educator on the former Yugoslavia. So first off, Ivan, thank you so much for coming back on the program. I'm just going to be very quiet now and be the student along with the rest of the audience. So you have a presentation for us about the once united Yugoslavia. The floor is yours. Go right ahead.
Indeed. So this is basically a story of former Yugoslavia, a short story or long, depending on how you look at it. But I'm just going to read it out for you. And this is the part 1 is a story from Slavic tribes to socialist revolution, all in half an hour. Yugoslavia is a word made up of 2 words, Yug and Slavia. Yug means south, Slavia means the land of the Slavs. Therefore, Yugoslavia literally means the land of the South Slavs. Origin story of the Slavs, which turns out to not necessarily be true, but is very neat, puts the origin of Slavs somewhere in the area of present-day Belarus and northern Ukraine. Slavs were various tribes that were each led by some kind of warrior figure, and what unified them is the language. They don't, of course, all speak the same language, but they all speak similar languages. They did not write, and that is part of the reason why the history is so muddy. No written record survives. Very little is known about their religion as well. There's some speculation that they worshipped a few gods, with the main one being very much akin to Zeus, but that may well have been the projection by the Greek chronicler we get this story from. Etymologically, Slav appears to refer back to either the term slava, which means celebration or glory in most Slavic languages, or slovo, which means word or a letter. The latter hypothesis makes sense in light of the Slavic term for the neighboring Germanic tribes and present-day Germans, which is Nemci, which literally translates as mutes or those without words. So, Slavs, the word, the Germans, no word. the word is also similar to the word slave, which has Latin origins, and this has led some Western scholars to connect this to the fact that some Slavs ended up as German and Spanish slaves in the 19th and 10th century. This hypothesis is more old-fashioned one, and most current-day historians, as is the trend in post-colonial era that we find ourselves in, tend towards the former, more subaltern explanations. If we learned anything in the period of the great expansion of the various disciplines of history and anthropology, etc., it is that there's a lot that we don't know and cannot know. In any case, there appears to have been a movement of these tribes happening in the 6th and 7th centuries westward and southward. The original group that stayed turned into Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians. Those who moved west ended up being Czechs, Slovaks, and Poles. and those who moved south ended up being Yugoslavs. Yugoslavs are from west to east or from northwest to southeast Slovenians, not to be confused with Slovaks, Croats, Bosniaks, Serbs, Montenegrins, and Macedonians. These Macedonians also not to be confused with Greek Macedonians of the Alexander the Great fame. Macedonians and Slovenians speak their own languages, while all the others speak the same language, which was once upon a time called Serbo-Croatian, but now goes by many names, even though it remains the same language. The difference between Serbian and Croatian is akin to a difference between the English spoken in Canada and in England. Bulgarians are a mix of Slavic and Bulgaric tribes and speak the same language as Macedonians. Of course, this story can be told in a different way. They would both simplify and erase some of the nations and their claims to distinction, and there is certainly no true story to be told again. But this is my story, and I'm sticking to it. And if you don't like it, I have others. One thing that is undoubtedly true is that no one was telling this story some 250 or 300 years ago. People were largely literate and unaware of their ethnic or national belonging. They hardly ever traveled, and only short distances. Tribal and communal belongings mattered a lot more than national or linguistic ones. Religion mattered a lot more than ethnicity or nationality, and was actually the basis for and the raw material upon which the stuff of nation was grafted after the printing press was introduced, along with industrial capitalism and the world market, and newspapers, books, and magazines began to tell people stories of their national belonging. South Slavs who settled in the Balkan Peninsula adopted Christianity from their neighbors and rulers, and first South Slavic kingdoms under the Christian flag emerged. Serbian, Croatian, and Bosnian kingdoms were short-lived, but they set the precedent for the later appropriation of their experience in the service of the construction of modern nations of Serbs, Croats, and Bosniaks. As the Holy Roman Empire was divided into western and eastern parts in 1054 of new era, so did the Slavs get divided. In fact, the lines of schism cut right through the middle of the land inhabited by southern Slavs. Croats and Slovenians ended up belonging to the Western Catholic Church, while Serbs, Montenegrins, Bulgarians, and Macedonians became Eastern Orthodox Christians. Those became main distinctions between them. In the rural borderland areas, people referred to each other as Orthodox and Catholic rather than Serbs and Croats well into the 20th century. Medieval Serbian kingdom, which was based in the southern part of today's Serbia, an area called Kosovo, and today inhabited mainly by Albanians who are descendants of ancient Illyrians who were in the area before Slavs arrived, was conquered by the Muslim Ottoman Empire in the 14th century in a series of battles, most famous of which, and the one that Serbian national mythology is largely based on, happened in 1389 in Kosovo Polje, Kosovo Plain. Ottomans managed to carry on and were not turned away until they were at the gates of Vienna, Austria. Austrian Empire, with much help from its Slavic subjects, managed to turn the Ottomans away back roughly to the line that originally demarcated the border between the Eastern and Western Holy Empire, with Bosnia, Serbia, Montenegro, Bulgaria, and Macedonia now belonging to the new Muslim Empire, and Croatia and Slovenia becoming part of the Catholic Austrian and later Austro-Hungarian Empire. That remained the state of affairs until the beginning of the 19th century. One significant development in those 400 years has been the creation of a nation of Bosniaks in Bosnia and Herzegovina and some parts of Serbia who were Serbs and Croats, Christians, who converted to Islam in order to gain favor with the crown and access various privileges that accrued to the practitioners of the official religion. A number of Serbs also migrated from southern parts of Serbia, Kosovo, into the border areas of Austrian Empire that were previously inhabited by Catholic Croats and Hungarians and served as border guards for the Austrian crown there. Much of the Serbian intelligentsia operated across the border and in a much friendlier Austrian Empire, and their relations with the neighboring Croats and Austrian authorities were amicable. Until, that is, the idea of Yugoslavia was beginning to be formed among those Serbs and Croats as an alternative to the empires, both Ottoman and Austrian. This Yugoslavian idea was actually operating concurrently with and in competition with the more narrow nationalistic ideas of separate Serbian and Croatian nations beginning in the 19th century. Both Serbs and Croats managed to win various degrees of autonomy from their respective empires throughout the 19th century in a series of national uprisings led by small landowners or knights and using peasants as the cannon fodder. Serbs eventually won statehood in the late 19th century, constituted themselves as an independent kingdom, and began a series of expansionist wars against their neighbors, Bulgarians, Albanians, and Turks. These were known as Balkan Wars, and they resulted in a sizable Serbian state, which was a protectorate of the Russian Empire, and a thorn in the side of the Austrian Empire, which itself managed to wrest Bosnia out of the hands of the declining Ottoman Empire, and to the chagrin of the Slavs of all three religions, Catholics, Orthodox, and Muslim, who inhabited it. Emboldened by the victories of the Balkan Wars, and oblivious to the suffering that those wars caused among their own people, let alone those whom they conquered, Serbian royals were not afraid to engage in a series of economic and political maneuvers against the no less belligerent Austrian Empire that ultimately culminated in the famous assassination of Austrian Archduke Ferdinand in Sarajevo, capital of Bosnia, by a member of a terrorist and militant anarchist, but also nationalist and Serbian Secret Service supported organization called Young Bosnia, or Black Hand, on June 28, 1914, which is the day of Serbian statehood. Serbian official war aims were to liberate all conquered southern Slavs and bring them into the same state. Led by Dimitrije Tucovic, Serbian Socialist Party was the only socialist party belonging to the Second International, other than the Russian one led by Comrade Lenin, that refused to vote for the war credits. Tucovic was familiar with the atrocities committed by the Serbian army in the recent Balkan Wars, especially against the Albanians in Kosovo, and has denounced them and believed that the workers and peasants of Serbia or any other country had nothing to gain from yet another war game orchestrated by kings and queens. Serbs were badly beaten in the early stages of the Great War and set out on a long retreat all the way down to Greece and across Albania, again burning and looting all the way along. Those who refused to participate in the atrocities, like the recruited Tucovic and his socialist comrades, were killed in friendly fire. Austrian army chasing the Serbs was manned by many Serbs and Croats whose fate was no more enviable. The morale of the soldiers on all fronts of the First World War was very low, as socialist ideas were beginning to percolate at the time, while the power of radio and printing press carrying nationalist propaganda did not yet manage to penetrate into villages and newly industrialized towns of the Balkans. Knowing that it'd be a pretty hard task to get Serbs and Croats to fight enthusiastically against the new shiny South Slavic state of Serbia, Austrian command decided to send its Serbs and Croats to the Eastern Front, where they en masse gave themselves up to their Eastern Slavic brethren. Many also joined the Great Russian Revolution and picked up communist ideas, while in Russia, where they were treated as human beings rather than serfs and cannon fodder by the Soviet state. One of these people was Josip Broz Tito, an industrial worker of peasant origin who was born on the border of Croatia and Slovenia to a Slovenian mother and Croatian father. Having been a labor organizer in Croatia and Austria before the war broke out, Tito, which is a pseudonym nom de guerre he was given later in the years when the party was banned and he had to go underground, was not unfamiliar with socialism and workers' struggle. He did not expect the revolution to actually happen, and certainly did not expect to find himself in St. Petersburg in the spring of 1917 actually participating in it. Over the next few years, he became a part of the newly established Communist Party of Yugoslavia, composed of expats who found themselves in Russia in the early 1920s. Many others returned from Russia without having joined the Communist Party of Yugoslavia, but with tales of the wonderful revolution, land to the peasants and factories to the workers, and promise of abundance and equality for all. One of them was my Croatian maternal great-grandfather, who learned Russian and literally fell in love with Russia and its new communist path. The good news wasn't lost on many other Serbian and Croatian peasants, and the children they raised, many of whom answered the call of the party to join the revolutionary resistance a few decades later. In the meanwhile, after 4 years of carnage, the war ended with the victory of the British, French, and Italian empires over the Austrian, Ottoman, or whatever was left of it, and German empires. Serbs who were on the winning side were recognized in the Treaty of Versailles as the rightful inheritors of the Slav-occupied lands and granted title to the lands that later came to be known as Yugoslavia. The official name of the new state was the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, Its official ruler was the Serbian king, and there were no rights of autonomy or statehood granted to the nations that came under the borders of this state. Officially and de facto, the state functioned as a centralized constitutional monarchy dominated by the most numerous nation, the Serbs, and organized socially as a capitalist state transitioning from feudal relations of production into the capitalist ones. The nascent working class and the young intellectuals at universities of all bigger cities were getting organized by the Communist Party, but the political scene was dominated by a monarchist Serbian Radical Party, which as the right hand of the king dominated the military, administration, and the police. The main opposition to the regime was organized by the Croatian Peasant Party, which, as the name indicates, represented the Croatian peasants who made up the great majority of the population of the seriously delayed proto-capitalist and increasingly comprador state, peasants, that is, not Croatian peasants specifically. Small but powerful Serbian bourgeoisie had no interest in listening to the grievances of Croatian peasants, and decade into the life of the new state, in a heated parliamentary debate, a representative of the Serbian bourgeoisie pulled out a gun and shot and killed a member of the Croatian Peasant Party. Amidst the calls for justice and autonomy from the Croatian representatives and further assertions of power by the Serbs, the king dismissed the parliament and declared a royal dictatorship. He renamed the state Yugoslavia in an attempt to gloss over the national differences, but the Great Depression, combined with an archaic and essentially pre-capitalist administration, only exacerbated the already miserable conditions of the peasants and workers of the country. While the Serbian peasants existed on national pride, Croatian peasants' discontent increasingly became fodder for the new and virulent form of nationalism that was making its appearance on the European scene, namely fascism. Some Croatian intellectuals and Catholic clergy entered into an alliance with a section of the Croatian Peasant Party and formed a fascist movement called Ustaše, meaning uprisers, and started with a series of clandestine and terrorist attacks on the Serbian rulers, culminating in the assassination of the King Alexander in 1934 in Marseille, which they carried out in cooperation with the Macedonian terrorist organization, whose aim was to liberate Macedonia from the Serbian yoke and attach it to Bulgaria. This, of course, only exacerbated the already rigid dictatorship and contributed to the dysfunctionality of the state. The ruling elite started to cozy up to the rising Nazi Germany, while the discontent among the workers and the peasants was increasingly finding hope and inspiration in socialism. The outlawed Communist Party found fertile ground in the working class and young urban intellectuals, as it was the only political formation advocating equality and respect among all nations, an anti-nationalist, in other words, solution to the problems plaguing the country. The leadership of the party again found refuge in Soviet Union, where, along with communists from other Eastern European nations, they both participated in and fell victim to the atmosphere of fear and denouncements that plagued the communist motherland in the 1930s. In one of the episodes of the Great Purge in the 1930s, the existing leader of the Communist Party of Yugoslavia, Milan Gorkic, was deposed and replaced by Tito, who, according to his later testimony, couldn't have been denounced as a fascist or a Trotskyist or a secret agent of the bourgeois state, as he had too great of credentials, having done serious time in Yugoslavian prison and having been a key contributor, along with 2,000 other Yugoslavian communists, to the Republican cause in the Spanish Civil War. He was also famous for having resolved the factional fight in the party in the 1920s between the leftists and the rightists in favor of organizing the workers, and for having spent a lot of time organizing inside the country clandestinely, while many other Communist Party leaders were safely operating from France and other Western European countries. A dedicated worker of peasant origin and a dedicated communist, Tito was a perfect candidate to lead the Communist Party of Yugoslavia. He was also conveniently not an overly charismatic orator or a polemicist. He preferred to do the work among the people and had no special relationship with the intellectual side of things, much like Comrade Stalin himself. When asked by a friend in the midst of a denouncement he was facing from some Bulgarian communists why he didn't write to Stalin and ask him to intervene on his behalf, Tito answered that he'd rather Stalin not be aware of him. The two never met until 1944. Serbian crown, now in the hands of a regent representing the young king in the waiting and in alliance with the fractional Croatian bourgeoisie, signed a military alliance with Germany in late March of 1941 to which the largely communist organized youth responded with massive protests in the capital Belgrade, which in turn encouraged the fraction of the military and the court politicians loyal to and funded by the British Secret Service to carry out a coup, deposing the regent and installing the still underage king who turned back on the regent's promise. The Axis powers responded with a declaration of war, which lasted 12 days and resulted in the royal court absconding with the state treasury and settling in London. 4,000 people were killed, and half of the housing dwellings were destroyed in the bombardment of the capital Belgrade. The country was parceled out into the spheres of influence, with Germany directly occupying the rump of Serbia, a piece of which was handed over to Bulgaria, another to Hungary, another to Albania, yet another, along with all of Bosnia and the rest of Croatia, having been handed over to Croatian fascist movement Ustaše to govern as a protectorate under the ironic name Independent State of Croatia. Adriatic coast, including Montenegro and parts of Croatia and Slovenia, were handed over to fascist Italy. Nazis began their campaign of terror and enslavement of the local population. Factories were uprooted and moved wholesale into Germany, along with the local population as prison laborers. Nazi science saw Slavs as slaves and a nuisance, and their land as living space for Germans. Local Germans were given Slav lands, and settlement of more Germans from Germany began in earnest. When the remnants of the Royal Army reconstituted themselves in the Serbian mountains and declared the beginning of resistance against the Nazis in the name of the Royal Court in London, they encountered very little support from the surrounding Serbian villages, whose love for the king has long been exhausted, and even less from other nations, which, although few were lovers of Nazi Germany and the occupation, welcomed an end to Serbian-dominated monarchy. It was only in some parts of Croatia where Serbs lived that King's army in the homeland, led by General Draža Mihailović, was welcomed as an answer to the independent state of Croatia's reign of terror against the Serbian civilian population. Namely, Ustaše wasted no time rounding up the Jews, anti-fascists, Roma, and Serbs, who comprised half of the new country's population, and summarily executing them or herding them into death camps. Officially, the plan was to resolve the Serbian problem by expelling a third of them, converting a third to Catholicism, and killing the third. But in reality, murder was the preferred solution of the zealots on the ground. Mass conversions were often just a ruse to get the people to all show up at the church, where they'd get locked in and massacred. Serbian civilians who managed to escape the terror ended up in the woods, where they were met by one of the two guerrilla armies. Chetniks, from the word Cheta, which means a platoon, followers of Draža Mihailović and the Serbian king, or partisans, from the word party, who were organized by the Communist Party of Yugoslavia. The former specialized in repaying the Croats in kind by slaughtering Croatian villages eye for an eye, while the other, who were preparing for armed uprising against the Nazis since 1938, and were also active in the cities where they carried out acts of sabotage, like my Serbian parental grandfather and his brothers, enforced strict party discipline and forbid acts of revenge while promoting brotherhood and unity among all nations of Yugoslavia, and called for an overthrow of the king as well as the Nazis and their domestic helpers. They managed to attract not only Serbs, Jews, and Roma, but also Croats and Muslims who were running away from the wrath of Chetniks, and all those who were inspired by the message of peace, equality, and universal fraternity of nations and peoples. Women were explicitly called upon to abandon their traditional gender roles of caretakers and wives and join the armed resistance on equal footing as men. Many, like my maternal grandmother, who was 18 at the time, answered the call and joined the resistance, thus advancing the women's liberation struggle a great deal. While Chetniks soon abandoned their fight against the Nazis for the lack of interest among Serbian royalists and in favor of, for them, much pressing struggle against the Croats, Muslims, Jews, Roma, and Communists, and began collaborating with the occupying forces whenever they determined that the situation strategically...
By the way, Ivan, sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to let you know that I'm still here. I just turned off my camera. That's all.
That's cool. That's cool, yeah. While Chetniks soon abandoned their fight against Nazis for the lack of interest among Serbian royalists and in favor of, for them, much prescient struggle against the Croats, Muslims, Jews, Romans, and Communists, and began collaborating with the occupying forces whenever they determined that the situation strategically called for it, Italian fascists were, for example, not carrying out atrocities against Serbian peasants like Croatian fascists were, so Chetniks concluded non-aggression pacts with them and received arms from them, which they turned against Croatian civilians. Partisans were uncompromising in the dedication and fervor with which they fought all fascists, foreign and domestic, and just as dedicated to the promotion of patriotism under the banner of brotherhood and unity. While Chetniks promised royal restoration, greater Serbia, and bloody revenge on all non-Serbs, partisans called for a unitary state of Serbs, Croats, and all other people who inhabited the territory of Yugoslavia, and for full national and cultural rights for each and every one of them. Chetniks looked to the past and dreamed of a pure ethno-state, while partisans dreamed of the future in which all are getting along. There were attempts to collaborate between the two nominally anti-fascist forces, and they were encouraged by the Allies, both the British, who were harboring the Serbian king with whom they had familial ties, and the Soviets, who were reluctant to piss off the British and the Americans, on whose aid they themselves depended, by promoting a revolution amidst a full-blown war in the Balkans at the expense of the anti-fascist struggle. Chetniks' lack of effort on the anti-fascist front and dedication to the struggle against communists, who were seeing increasing success, having established the first free republic in the occupied Europe in the summer of 1941, and having tied up 100,000 German troops in Bosnia, the entire 6th Army of Wehrmacht, which had to be redeployed from the Eastern Front, however, left Allies no choice. The British and the Americans switched their allegiance, deciding to stop Hitler now and worry about communism later, just like they've successfully done in France and Italy, while the Soviets welcomed the opportunity to openly support their ideological peers in the Balkans. The new People's Federal Republic of Yugoslavia was declared on November 29, 1943, in one of those liberated territories in Bosnia. The document was heavy on patriotism and anti-fascism and light on detail and on socialism, but it was clear that no room was allowed for royal restoration or ethno-nationalist projects. Yugoslavs, and in this their unique in occupied Europe, liberated themselves. By the end of the war, Tito had 800,000 people under arms, and there was no doubt about who was in charge. Chetniks and Ustašas and the recruits who comprised the regular Croatian army were allowed to switch sides. Amnesty was declared on November 21, 1944, and many, including my maternal Croatian grandfather, joined the partisans. The few who distinguished themselves by exceptional dedication to the slaughter of innocents decided to persist in their fight to the bitter end, even after Germany capitulated, and they were instructed by the Axis official capitulation documents to give themselves up to the Allied army in the territory they found themselves in this case, Yugoslavian People's Army. They continued their retreat into Western Allied occupied Austria in hope of meeting a kinder fate. Some indeed managed to make it to Italy, Austria, and the rest of Western Europe, while some ultimately settled in Canada, the United States, Argentina, Australia, etc., where they were greeted with open arms by the capitalist states, who reverted back to prioritizing anti-communism over anti-fascism. Some were turned away and executed on the spot. Those became the martyrs whom the Croatian fascist diaspora used to build their national myth around and begin the next round of their nationalist struggle. The leader of Ustaša, Ante Pavelić, along with many other high-ranking Ustaše, escaped through Vatican's so-called rat channels and settled in Argentina. They continued their feud with Chetniks across the West, where they settled, and Pavelić became a victim of it. He died in Spain under General Franco's protection in 1959 from the consequences of a bullet wound courtesy of a Chetnik assassin. He left behind him a well-organized and reconstituted transcontinental Croatian fascist diaspora organization that would end up playing a crucial part in the destruction of socialist Yugoslavia in 1990s. Chetniks were, according to the severity of their crimes, treated less harshly. Some found their fate in the woods of Slovenia and Austria along with Ustaša, but the overwhelming majority accepted Tito's amnesty and continued to live in peace after the revolution without, of course, getting the opportunity to join the party or hold high-ranking positions in the government. They were closely watched by the Secret Service, but they did not experience any state terror, torture, or brutality. The leader of the Chetniks, Draža Mihailović, was caught and put on trial for atrocities against civilians in collaboration with the Nazis and sentenced to death. He too became a martyr for Serbian royalist anti-communist diaspora to rally around. Another prominent member of Mihailovic's army, Momčilo Đujić, an Orthodox priest from Dalmatia, who distinguished himself with gruesome acts of terror against Croatian civilians under the protection of Italian fascists, managed to escape across the Atlantic and settle in San Marcos, California, and organized the return of the king from there, along with the king himself, who remained in London, where he lived out his life on the stolen state treasury and under the protection of our own monarch, Her Majesty the British Queen. Both Jewish and King Peter died in peace and from old age in USA and Great Britain, respectively. The king's son Alexander now lives between Serbia and England, still plotting to reconquer his throne and gathering around him the most reactionary elements whose time should have passed long, long ago.
Wow.
That's part one.
That's only that. Yeah, it's exactly. That's just part one. Go ahead. Go on to part two.
Do you have time for this, man?
Yeah, sure. Just make sure that you have a good glass of water, though.
Part two, Socialist Yugoslavia. The British and the Americans did their best to prevent the constitution of a communist state after the war and the revolution by promoting solutions to the post-war government in Yugoslavia that kept the door open to the restoration of kingdom by tying military aid to Tito's partisans to political concessions, such as getting Tito to accept king's representatives in his provisional government. Tito agreed to work with king's chosen representatives, but only after ensuring that the king denounced Draža Mihailović and the Chetniks. King directed the troops loyal to him to join the partisans on September 12, 1944, and only in symbolic fashion. He insisted that he cannot guarantee what kind of government Yugoslavia will have after the war. That was, he insisted, up to the people to decide in democratic elections. Indeed, his popularity and fame and the fact that partisans took ownership of their struggle and the enthusiasm of the masses ensured that he was elected president of the new state by an overwhelming majority. To ensure that there is no Western meddling, Tito did his best to prevent the Western Allied troops from entering Yugoslavian territory, while he gave the Soviet Union a go-ahead to enter the country from the northeast. Indeed, it was a joint operation of the Soviet Red Army and the Yugoslavian partisans that liberated Belgrade in the fall of 1944. Tito visited Moscow earlier in the year to iron out the details of the plan. That was also the first time he met Comrade Stalin. Stalin seemed to have genuinely adored his Yugoslavian counterpart, and the two met often in the next few years of the early Yugoslavian socialist state and reconstruction. Indeed, Yugoslavs set out on a very ambitious plan of reconstruction of the devastated peasant country with major help from the Soviet experts and aid. Their first 5-year plan, introduced in 1947, after the was modeled on the Soviet plans, Soviet ones. The reconstruction began in earnest, and with free and enthusiastic labor of the millions of peasants and decommissioned partisans. The expropriators were expropriated, railway lines built, and entire industrial towns were raised from nothing. In October 1944, within days of the Tito-Šubašić agreement, the government began its nationalization of domestic property by transforming all property owned by the enemy combatants to public ownership. 3 weeks later, at the third session of anti-fascist forces of Yugoslavia on November 21st, 1944, the core of the post-war socialist property sector was established by expropriating the property of the German state, of war criminals, and of obvious collaborators. This was all the easier because the Axis occupiers had themselves expropriated the core of Yugoslav mining and industry to support their war effort. For example, Germans owned the lead and zinc mines at Trepča, which were formerly British, the Alatini chrome mine, formerly British, the Bor copper mine, formerly French, the Zenica steel plant, the Bata leather works, formerly Czech, and many textile and cotton mills, a total of 55% of Yugoslav industry. In August 1945, and agrarian reform in turn legalized the wartime expropriations, property taken into local control in order to wage war, and the landed estates and capitalist farms of the enemy and the collaborators that were nationalized by fiat in November 44. Into this national land fund also went all land holdings in excess of 100 hectares that had been owned by banks, industrial enterprises, monasteries, charitable trusts, and churches. This was a quote from Woodward, Susan Woodward's book, Socialist Unemployment, I think. And I'm relying upon her for quite a bit here. And Unkovski Korica, whose book is called Economic Struggle for Power. Huge 416 million aid package from Western funded UN program helped miraculous reconstruction that saw the war-ravaged country return to its pre-war capacity in only 2 years. Unkovski Korica writes, law on agrarian reform and colonization redistributed 797,000 hectares, went to 316,405 peasants and their families, of whom 136,454 had been landless or were colonists, and almost half as much land went to the state farms and agencies, as well as general cooperatives. There was a major transfer of largely poor and landless peasants from Montenegro, Bosnia, and Croatia into Vojvodina, where large landowners, many of whom were ethnic Germans, were dispossessed. This benefited hitherto landless Serbian peasants in Bosnia more than Muslim and Croatian ones, who tended to be landowners. The debate, similar to the one that happened in USSR in the late 20s and early 30s over how to feed the industrializing cities, or over the extent and the form of agricultural collectivization, occurred, but the access to foreign aid and the fact that the peasants were really the backbone of the Communist Party made it so that the big clash between the party and the peasants did not have to occur. Even after the reform, the majority of land remained in private hands, and much of the agricultural product was sold on the private market. Again, quoting Unkovski Korica, when finally adopted in 1947, the first 5-year plan expected industry to develop to 4.9 times the pre-war level on the basis of 41.6% of total investment, while agriculture could expect only 7% of investment in order to grow 1.5 times. Eventually, more than 1 million young women and men participated in the implementation of over 70 federal infrastructure projects, many of which had great symbolic value in the construction of Yugoslavian identity between 1946 and 1952. Some of the issues that arose in the few years immediately following the conclusion of the war, and that led to a quarrel between the leadership of the Communist Party of Yugoslavia and the USSR-led Communist Information Bureau, which is what replaced the Third International, which dissolved in the Second World War and lasted until 1956, are the Yugoslavs' refusal to allow USSR Navy to dock in the Adriatic, their persistent support for Greek communist guerrillas, and close relationships with Hoxha and Dimitrov, and an attempt to establish a Balkan Federation and the form it would take, and later a refusal on the part of the Communist Party of Yugoslavia to address the criticisms that were leveled at them. There also appears to have been some difference over Yugoslavs' attitude towards Western economic aid, them having signed onto the Marshall Plan and pulled out the last moment at the behest of the Cominform. After a year or so of bickering and a few back-and-forth letters, the infamous Info Bureau resolution arrived. And these are the points of the resolution of the Informational Bureau of the Communist Parties of June 28th, 1948. Again, June 28th, the day of Serbian statehood, the same date on which Archduke Ferdinand was killed. I don't think it's an accident. Number one, Yugoslavian Party is backing away from Marxism-Leninism. Number two, Soviet experts and representatives in Yugoslavia are being followed by Secret Service and treated the same as the representatives of imperialist nations. Yugoslavs have allowed proliferation of theories describing Soviet regime as comprised or inauthentic, compromised or inauthentic along the lines of Trotskyist critique. Yugoslavs are behaving more nationalistically than communistically. Number 3, Communist Party of Yugoslavia is allowing the situation in the countryside to continue as is without nationalizing the land and dispossessing the kulaks. It has declared peasants rather than the workers as the strongest bedrock of our state. Number 4, the Communist Party of Yugoslavia is under threat of being liquidated and dissolved into the People's Front, which includes all kinds of bourgeois elements from the countryside as well as from the cities, and which has become the official voice of Yugoslavian politics in a formal sense. Number 5, sectarian, bureaucratic, undemocratic, and secretive party organization, which does not allow for the participation of the masses. There is also a military type way of running the party, reminiscent of Trotsky's style. Arrests of comrades Zhujević and Hebrang for speaking in favor of better relations with USSR speak to the repressive and undemocratic nature of the Communist Party of Yugoslavia. Number 6, hasty dekulakization in response to the critique without first collectivizing agriculture. Hasty nationalization of small industry and trade in response to critique. Number 7, nationalism has won out against internationalism in Communist Party of Yugoslavia, and the leadership believes that they can continue without the support of other communist countries and parties and negotiate with imperialist countries on their own and not get sucked into their orbit. There is always a temptation to look behind what is explicitly said and look for real reasons behind things, especially when one of the parties involved is Joseph Stalin, who many
Western historians made,
there's always a temptation to look behind what is explicitly said and to look for real reasons behind things, especially when one of the parties involved is Comrade Stalin, who many Western historians have made careers out of psychoanalyzing and assigning malicious and personal motivations to. Yugoslavs and even Soviet leaders after Stalin died were no different. They accused him of being controlling and intolerant, of ruling with an iron fist, and eliminating any and all challenge to his authority before it materialized. How could such an authoritarian dictator allow anyone but the most obedient and subservient to rule any of the colonies? The story goes. The problem here is that, on the one hand, American diplomats agreed with the leadership of the USSR even before it came out against the Yugoslavian leadership, that the biggest possible fissure between the Yugoslavs and the Soviets was indeed the former's nationalism. They noticed how selfishly Tito guarded Yugoslavian independence in their dealings with him during the war, going so far as to suggest collaborating with Croatian nationalists in order to prevent the Allies landing on Yugoslavian territory, and predicted accurately that this may be the fault line to be exploited if the split between the two could be achieved. At first, they were scared of Yugoslavs, seeing Tito and his comrades as a bunch of renegades and loose cannons who were more communist than Soviets and who couldn't be reasoned with. Even after the quarrel between Tito and Stalin resulted in a full-out split, American diplomats remained wary of Yugoslavs' unpredictability and zealousness. Even after they recognized the value in the split in the communist movement, they never really fully embraced Tito and continued to fear his brand of communist nationalism, especially when he ended up organizing with all the non-communist but very nationalist and anti-colonialist third world states through the non-aligned movement. The other issue was the fact that communist ideology, as we know, is indeed a real thing. It is a consciously political, collectivist, anti-imperialist system of thought, and not just a veil behind which personal ambition hides. If Stalin was uncomfortable with Yugoslavian comrades intervening in Greece or in Albania behind the backs of the rest of the communist allies, or with allowing kulaks to proliferate at the expense of poor peasants and collectivization, that was because he thought that it was important to close ranks and be transparent, as well as organized as a bloc, and put the interests of the international communism first and those of the regional or national states second. If Tito, on the other hand, jealously guarded Yugoslavia's independence from its communist allies, if he sought to unite the Balkans and later the entire Third World through an online movement, or ignore Stalin's deals with the British and the Americans, that was not necessarily because he was a power-hungry authoritarian who couldn't stand to be in the shadow of Stalin, but because he truly believed what he was saying and doing, that the Greeks should fight on, that the Balkan Federation would strengthen communism in the Balkans, and that the conditions on the ground justified such special and distinct local entities, as well as decentralization of the power blocks. If he was reluctant to go after the rich peasants like Stalin did in the 1930s, that may well have been because he simply did not believe that rich peasants were the main problem, but rather that they could indeed be incorporated into the socialist society or turned, so to say, in less forceful and hasty ways. The significance of this event cannot be overstated. It is an event that, insofar as the issues that arose from it and the response to it, explains in itself the subsequent history of socialist Yugoslavia. Everything that followed was in one way or another a response to or a reaction to that singular event and can be traced and related to it. Yugoslavia's geopolitical reorientation towards the Third World can be traced back to Stalin's accusation of Yugoslavs of nationalism and proclivity to put the interests of the peasantry before those of the workers. Yugoslav's continued militarism and ultimate bloody end can also be glimpsed in the Cominform accusation of Yugoslavs as running a militaristic style operation. But it is not only Yugoslavia's future that relates back to these issues raised in the Communist Information Bureau resolution. Another first was the revolution in the form of peasant-dominated war of national liberation led by renegade guerrilla warrior. Everyone has a poster of Che, many had posters of Mao, and were waving the little red book with his quotations, and some even followed Albania's Enver Hoxha as the torchbearer of the correct communist path. But there is no shirts with Tito's face on them, or Tito's parties outside of Yugoslavia. In fact, there are hardly any in Yugoslavia right now, even though he was actually the first to lead the peasant guerrilla army to victory against colonialism and new colonialism and show that there is more than one way to socialism. Yugoslavia was a model for anti-colonial national liberation movements. From China to Cuba, Tito was the original Mao or Ho, Che, or Amilcar Cabral, the leader of the peasant-dominated guerrilla army that arose from national liberation struggle against the colonial power. Tito described as moderate in the West. He's described as moderate in the West, and he certainly cultivated that image along with his image of worldly man of sophisticated tastes, who was equally at home visiting with the British Queen as with African peasant revolutionaries. Tito became a bit of a media superstar and behaved like one, going through wives and mansions rather quickly and traveling on his luxury boat across the world, visiting kings and queens, capitalists as much as communist heads of state, schmoozing with Hollywood stars, and generally just living it up big time. He was far from moderate, actually, except in a sense of his moderate commitment to the international communist movement and project. One really important way in which he was not moderate at all is in a way that he dealt with his opposition. He was the harshest of all East European communists, first by summarily executing tens of thousands of fascist collaborators at the end of the war, and then by imprisoning and torturing 16,000 communists, 400 or so of whom died, who were loyal to Stalin on Goli Otok. The two high-profile Politburo members who agreed with the Soviet critique of the Communist Party of Yugoslavia and who would have been preferred by Moscow as leaders of Yugoslavia, Andrija Hebrang, a Croat, and Sreten Žujović Crni, a Serb, were given an opportunity to correct themselves. The latter took it, and after being relieved of his position and put under house and for a brief period real arrest, publicly declared his earlier views as false and USSR as imperialist. He was given a position of a commercial director of the party newspaper, and his party membership was restored. He died in peace. The former basically told the head of the Secret Service to piss off, was put on a trial for becoming a Soviet spy, having, so the story goes, been blackmailed into becoming one after having been caught red-handed by the Soviets for collaborating with Gestapo and Croatian Nazis, and for attempting to sabotage Yugoslavian economy in his capacity as the president of the Economic Council and the Planning Commission. His official cause of death in prison, less than a year after the Infantry resolution was suicide. The difference in faith between the two may also have something to do with Hebrang's other sin, which is that of Croatian nationalism. It earned him which also earned him a rehabilitation by the post-communist and anti-communist 1990s government of Croatia. 16,000 others, almost exclusively long-standing and decorated party members, many of whom participated in the Spanish Civil War on the Republican side, ended up on the newly minted and largely built by them prison on a small island on the Adriatic called Goli Otok, which translates as Barren Island or Naked Island, where they were subjected to disgusting humiliation and torture, having been forced to beat each other and go without water for long periods of time, and so on. Tito turned his foreign policy, his geopolitical gaze to the third world. He skillfully maneuvered allies away from China and a focus on anti-colonialism and into neutrality and equidistance from both superpowers by starting a non-aligned movement 6 years after the meeting of Asian and African states in Bandung. Many of these states that were now in the non-aligned movement were not so equidistant. They were actually, some of them were in open military alliance with superpowers. What distinguished them was that they were not hardcore communist countries.
Yeah.
So some of the big players in the online movement were Egypt, Ghana, Indonesia, Ethiopia, India. They relied on UN, including International Monetary Fund and World Bank as vehicles for development. By independence, they meant peaceful coexistence and international cooperation rather than isolation and anti-bloc politics. Again, like this anti-bloc, like what they meant by equidistance was openness to both blocs rather than rejection of both of them and forming a third bloc. And but they did contain, they were anti-imperialist, they were anti-colonial and socialist, some of them. And there was a debate. There was a famous debate that came to a head between Tito and Fidel Castro at the non-aligned Congress in Havana in 1978, at which Fidel tried to get the movement to commit to anti-imperialism and an alliance with the anti-colonial and communist superpower. And Tito won out by insisting on equidistance from both superpowers and anti-bloc politics as the guiding principle of the movement. Self-management in Yugoslavia was definitely a top-down project. This is not to say that it was anti-democratic or hierarchical. It was in fact a response to labor flight and resistance rather than an initiative by the revolutionary proletariat, an attempt to control the insubordinate working class and give it stake in the development project, to get it to take ownership and responsibility over socialist project as a whole rather than focusing on individual and even shop floor or company level interests. Also, it was an attempt to streamline the state and eliminate the unnecessary expenditure of resources and energy. Working class was not the driver of socialism in Yugoslavia, or the nucleus, or the most important element of the Yugoslavian Communist Party. The Yugoslavian Communist Party was actually made up largely of peasants who fought in the War of National Liberation, and it was led by the small group of intellectuals who were professional revolutionaries. It is hard to separate nationalism from anti-communism in Yugoslavian case. Indeed, one of the biggest lessons of Yugoslavian experience is that the two are intrinsically connected and always come connected at the hip. Student demonstrations of 1968 were a relatively small and short-lived affair that was resolved by Tito's personal intervention by a way of addressing the students over the TV, legitimizing their existential and economic concerns by promising better bursaries and canteen food. A few of the more serious anti-communists and reformers got drowned in the sea of the majority of students who indeed appreciated Yugoslavian socialism and loved Tito and what he stood for. Croatian Spring of 1971 was a nationalist uprising of the Croatian intellectuals, which was a little more serious and which revived some of the specters and memory of the dreaded and scary prospect of Croatian independence, which has forever been wedded to its historical fascist ally. The prospect of bringing that ghost back actually helped the Yugoslav state isolate a few Croatian nationalists and convince the rest that this was not the road they would want to take. The uprising was mainly of intellectuals, although some diasporic elements did raise the old flag and insignia and revive some old songs. About 2,000 people were arrested briefly, and some functionaries lost their positions. This event can also be described as a battle between Unitarian and separatist forces within the Croatian League of Communists, in which the reformers won out, in which the Unitarian element won out. The 1974 Constitution is often understood as a concession to this separatist stream within Croatian party organization, an entrenching of republic's rights to territorial integrity and national rights up to and including secession, and therefore a basis for the wars in the 1990s, both in a sense that it laid the ground or provided the blueprint for the eventual borders, but also in a sense that it decentralized power and gave nationalists an opportunity to practice playing state. It entrenched national rights in the republics so that Serbs, most relevantly, were no longer carrying rights as one of the constitutive nations of Yugoslavia, wherever on its territory they may find themselves, but rather as a dominant nation within the Republic of Serbia. They had no recourse within the constitutional channels to refuse to become a part of independent Croatia or independent Bosnia once they decided to leave Yugoslavia. Their only legal recourse was to go to the republic which belonged to them to get, in other words, ethnically cleansed. 1980 Kosovo demonstrations and Tito's response was to emphasize development rather than repression. Aleksandar Rakovic, who was always an advocate of centralization and the head of Secret Service, and was keeping a lid of Albanian irredentism and nationalism in Kosovo for a few decades, wanted to crack down even further, but was replaced by Tito in 1966 and forced into silence and retirement over having been caught spying on Tito and other Politburo members. He became a sort of martyr for Serbian nationalists, whose obsession with Kosovo was born in this moment as a response to the relaxation of the repressive measures against Albanians and the consequent campaign of subtle but effective campaign of ethnic cleansing of the Serbs from the area. Rankovic's funeral in 1983, which attracted a huge crowd of over 100,000 people, is often taken to be the beginning of Serbian nationalist campaign to regain Kosovo. This story will be crucial to the understanding of the eventual breakup of Yugoslavia and the rise of Slobodan Milošević to the head of the Serbian Communist Party organization in the late 1980s. Food was free, provided in schools to school children. There was no charge for that. Daycare was free. Even pre-daycare was free. People were spending 10% or less of their income on housing expenses. Retirement age was 50 for women, 55 for men. Universities were free, including residence and food. There was a free system of music and art schools. Of course, healthcare, very broadly defined, including pharmacare, dental, mental, etc.
Ivan, sorry to interrupt. Even mental health care was free in Yugoslavia, merged in a single-payer system.
Yes. Everything was free. There was no paying for.
All right, continue. Sorry, that's just continue. Sorry to interrupt. That's just fascinating.
For sure, man. Summer vacations at the seaside were considered a right. There was a network of workers' vacation resorts. Everything was run through workplaces. Housing, vacations, dentist offices were in workplaces, so that the big factory in a particular part of town would be responsible not only for the workers in that factory, but also for others in the neighborhood who may not be affiliated with that particular workplace. There was inequality. It was embedded in the system, with high party functionaries, directors of big, important, and successful companies getting the best salaries, homes in previously wealthy neighborhoods, and vacation homes, as well as, and perhaps more so, growing wildly outside and in opposition to the system through corruption, whereby people in positions of power could exchange favors for bribes. Those working in the West, either through foreign worker programs in Western Europe, or as immigrants who lived and worked in the West, or as representatives of various public enterprises, and those who managed to convert some of their money into small private enterprises, cafes, inns, restaurants, etc., managed to stand out from the crowd and own luxury cars and other Western goods, luxury homes and vacation properties, but no one owned buildings or large companies. There was no grand bourgeoisie. The poor also existed, mainly Roma people, although by no means all Roma were poor, who remained marginalized and literally on the margins of society, living in poor villages and shanty towns at the outskirts of town. Those existing on social programs, begging, junk collecting, living off of music and petty theft. There were also people who lived in substandard and very small houses without modern toilets. But even those people were entitled to free vacations and all kinds of school and after-school programs that were only accessible to the well-off in the West. I had friends on both sides of the fence. I remember a family that owned a house with a pool in the richest part of town, a huge yellow Ford car, and a restaurant. These were the wealthiest people I knew or knew of. And I remember one of my friends from school who lived in a very small old house with one room with his single mom in a yard that they shared with a bunch of other families. I myself grew up always hearing my parents discussing the possibility of us moving out of the country. For a few years, on one of those, moving out of the country for a few years on one of those foreign representative gigs that my father was always after. The most sought after gigs were those in foreign offices of our companies. They were very lucrative as the wages were somehow grossly inflated due to the significant difference in purchasing power within and without the country. My parents never managed to pull off one of those gigs, but they worked for the national airline company and had preferential access to the outside. They helped many of their relatives emigrate to Canada and Australia during the 70s and 80s, and those favors became handy when it was time for me to run from draft and civil war in the early 1990s. Small-time smuggling of consumer goods like running shoes, vitamin creams, jeans, etc., also helped supplement my parents' salaries quite a bit. In the 70s and 80s, national economies and tariffs still existed, and you could buy a pair of pants for $20 in USA and sell them in Yugoslavia for 150, buy a liter of rakia, plum brand in Yugoslavia, for $2 and sell it in Canada for 20. The black market was growing, and capitalism and entrepreneurship were thriving underneath the nominally socialist economy. We managed to reach a pretty high level of wealth, considering the possibilities in the socialist economy. We owned a modest house in a modest neighborhood and a small vacation home on the seaside and a modest car. I always wondered how much money my dad could make if he lived in the West, where money was much easier to make and where wealth accumulation was allowed beyond that basic, modest or reasonable level.
Wow.
Part 3, the Balkan tragedy of the 1990s. Kosovo was the seat of the medieval Serbian kingdom, and the Serbian Orthodox Church before it, along with the rest of Serbia, was taken over by Ottoman Empire in 1448 and ruled from Istanbul as an administrative region. Albanians and Serbs fought together against the Ottomans, both as Christians, most famously in the Battle of Kosovo Polje in 1389. During 500 years of Ottoman rule, many Albanians converted to Islam and gained certain privileges, such as an opportunity to become regional overlords, while the Serbs remained Christian, allied with the Habsburg Empire, and participated in Habsburg-Ottoman wars on the side of the Austrians, for what they were punished after losing twice, and which resulted in 2 great migrations of the Serbs from Kosovo region into the Habsburg Empire in 1683 to 1699 and 1737 to 39. Today, these regions are Croatian borderland regions with Bosnia, also known as Serbian Krajina. Note that the term Krajina only misses an U for it to become Ukraina, aka Ukraine. This is not accidental. Both mean borderland. Both were borderlands with Ottoman Empire. Not, in other words, denoting a distinct ethnic group, but rather a geographic position occupied by an ethnic group. The region fell back into the hands of the Serbs in 1913, after the Serbs, together with Bulgarians and Greeks, defeated the Ottoman Empire in the First Balkan War and extended their territory into Kosovo. They came out winners from the First World War again and ruled the region under three different principalities. They committed atrocities against the Albanian population in revenge for the latter's domination of them as Ottomans' junior partners. When Italians occupied Kosovo in 1941, they gave the territory to Albanians to rule, and up to 250,000 Serbs got expelled from Kosovo. When Socialist Yugoslavia was formed after the World War II, Kosovo was given a status of an autonomous region within Serbia in recognition of its Albanian majority. The expelled Serbs, who now tipped the ethnic scale in Serbia in favoring Serbia's other autonomous region of Vojvodina, which was recognized as distinct for its large Hungarian minority as well as very diverse ethnic mix, including Romanians, Roma, Croats, Ruthenians, etc., were never allowed to return, while the Albanian majority was not given the opportunity agreed upon between Albanian and Yugoslav communists in the middle of the war to choose to become a part of Albania in a referendum. Kosovo's autonomy was not symbolic only. It was very real, with Albanian language, radio, television, healthcare, education, as well as civil service and policing, although most of these tangible ways in which Albanians got to exercise their autonomy were delayed by Tito's comrade-in-chief of state security, previously mentioned Aleksandar Ranković, until 1966, when he was quietly removed from his function on account of having been discovered to have been spying on Tito himself. As the economic underdevelopment continued, so did the ethnic tensions, with Serbs getting terrorized by their Albanian neighbors, with the police forces refusing to help and pushed out of the province in a campaign of subtle but systemic ethnic cleansing. By the time Albanian students and intellectuals rose up in revolt in 1981, demanding first jobs and better standard of living, but soon transforming into demands of the status of a republic for Kosovo equal to Serbia, the ethnic composition of Kosovo was heavily in favor of Albanians. The protests were suppressed, but the situation remained unchanged. The economic concerns were not addressed, and Serbian intellectuals began a campaign of their own to return Kosovo to Serbia and started publicizing the suffering of Serbs in Kosovo very loudly. Soon, they extended their grievances to the rest of the country, asserting that Serbs, who are the biggest and strongest nation in Yugoslavia, are everywhere in the country treated as second-rate citizens, and beginning to raise the specter of Greater Serbia that would include all lands in which Serbs live under the Serbian state. The infamously leaked, unfinished Memorandum of the Serbian Academy of Arts and Sciences was a document that assessed the situation in the country, Yugoslavia, from a nationalist perspective and served as an intellectual basis for the above outlined worldview. The main thesis of the memorandum is economic, that Serbian economy has been undermined by the federal policies and made to lag behind those of the western provinces of Slovenia and Croatia, for which they blamed Tito and Kardelj, who was the main architect of the economic policy of Yugoslavia, strongly suggesting that their national belonging, Tito being half Slovene, half Croat, and Kardelj being a Slovenian, was at play. But the biggest and most emphasized part of the memorandum had to do with the situation of Serbs in Yugoslavia, and more specifically, the situation in Kosovo, which described the situation of Serbs in Kosovo as being threatened with extinction and genocide under the pressure of the militant, counter-revolutionary, anti-socialist, and anti-Yugoslav forces of Albanian nationalism. The percentage of the Serbs in Kosovo falling from 34% after Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia was constituted after World War II to 18% in the mid-80s was cited as proof of this trend, and the disappearance of Serbs from Kosovo was predicted within the next 10 years if something isn't done to stop this trend. There was a sense of urgency and haste to save the Serbian nation and its territories. A similar story was told of the Serbs in Croatia. They were said to be inhabiting the least developed areas of the republic and economically forced to emigrate to Serbia or to the Croatian cities where they were getting assimilated into the Croatian nation. The Serbs in Croatia, according to memorandum, have never been as threatened as in the current era, barring the period of the Second World War. Memorandum was preceded by an informal meeting of the very select group of Slovenian and Serbian intellectuals in 1985, at which the two were looking to find common ground around the questions of various political economic crises Yugoslavia was facing. Serbs' proposal to reorganize Yugoslavia's political system along more bourgeois democratic lines and along the principle one man, one vote was met with Slovenia's assertion that they really don't see the point of keeping Yugoslavia together. The two agreed that the political system needed reorganizing, although the Serbs saw reforms being carried out through the Communist League and the Slovenians tended towards multi-party bourgeois democracy, but beyond that there was no agreement. The Serbs wanted more centralized Yugoslavia, Slovenians wanted independence. Indeed, the Slovenian-owned version of memorandum came out months after the Serbian one, but only because the Serbian memorandum was accidentally leaked first, and the editors of the journal, which was about to have the Slovenian version published, delayed it for a bit to see what will happen with the Serbian document. It was called Contribution for the Slovenian National Program, and it came out in the special edition of the magazine called Nova Revija, New Review. It referred to Yugoslav People's Army as an occupation force and referred to the dilution of the Slovenian nation by the immigration of Southerners into Slovenia as a national crisis akin to that to the one Serbian intellectuals sounded out about the situation of Serbs in Kosovo and Croatia. Croatian party organization remained formally silent, but that very silence was an act of independence insofar as it was premised on the idea that the memorandum affair was an internal matter for the Serbian party organization to address and not something other republics should concern themselves with. A more nationalistic current in Croatian politics would explain this silence as a part of a larger period of what they called Croatian silence, occasioned by the suppression of a similar attempt by the Croatian intellectuals to reform Croatian politics and Croatia's relationship with other Yugoslavian republics in 1971. Indeed, the so-called Croatian Spring was dealt with independently by the Croatian party organization. Now, Croats expected the Serbian party organization to deal with this on its own. The leadership of the Serbian and Belgrade Communist Party organization did just that. It condemned the memorandum as nationalistic and divisive, as calling for war and destruction of socialist Yugoslavia, and demanded of the Serbian Academy of Arts and Sciences to distance itself from the document and fire the existing leadership. Instead, at the irregularly assembled Congress of the Academy in December 1986, members decided to focus on the matter of the unfinished memorandum, which they neither endorsed, published, or discussed, being leaked, and their 100th anniversary being cancelled as unjustified attacks on the organization. 3 honorable men came out against the document, but the majority refused to condemn it or the leadership of the organization. Indeed, the leak was an affair in itself, and theories of how it ended up being discovered abound to this day. The official story is that one of the academics who worked on it left it on his desk, where his journalist son-in-law found it. Others have said that the text was never hidden and could easily have been discovered by janitorial staff or really anybody hanging around the offices of many of the academics involved in composing it. A most interesting, in my opinion, most believable version of the event is that the document was leaked on purpose by its authors in order for them to avoid responsibility for having to actually present it and defend it and discuss it publicly and deal with the possible consequences, including political repression of doing so. But not all Serbian communists agreed. Slobodan Milošević, who never explicitly came out in favor of the memorandum nor condemned it, gave his assent in deeds. Shortly after the memorandum was leaked, in April of 1987, he went to Kosovo to visit the provincial party organization, and in famous TV moment, after being told by an ordinary Serbian citizens out on the street that the police has been beating them, told the man, "They aren't allowed to beat you. Nobody's allowed to beat you. They aren't going to beat you." Mm-hmm. What followed was a whole night of him and the rest of the party officials, both Serbian and Albanian, listening to the people, stepping up and telling stories of being beaten, humiliated, pressured to leave, and so on. This ushered in an enormous rise in popularity of Slobodan Milošević, his takeover of the Serbian party apparatus, his massive rallies across Serbia and Montenegro, culminating with a huge one in Kosovo at the site of the Battle of Kosovo on its 6th centenary. These events were colloquially known as the happening of the people or anti-bureaucratic revolution, and they were essentially an awakening of the Serbian national consciousness embodied in the persona of Slobodan Milošević. Old monarchist and collaborationist songs, flags, insignia were being brought out. People who were considered traitors and enemies of the people were coming out of the woodwork and flying into Serbia from abroad. Massive money was being raised from them and from all the citizens for the construction of the biggest Orthodox church in the world in Belgrade. It had a golden dome, and it was visible. It had a golden dome, and it was visible from my mother's hospital room, where she was dying of cancer. I looked through the window and asked her if she agreed that it was beautiful. She answered that there were cockroaches walking up the walls in the hospital. Milošević proceeded to virtually erase Kosovo's and Vojvodina's independence and effect a veritable coup d'etat in Montenegro with the help of popular working-class uprising, which started as, at first, work stoppages demanding higher wages in response to rapid inflation and a general expression of discontent with the economic and social crisis that has engulfed the country, and complaints of the party organization's alienation from the people by way of entrenched and stale bureaucratization of a nomenclature, but quickly morphed into expressions of support for Milošević's what used to be called Unitarian agenda of first consolidating the power of Serbian party organization over its entire territory, thus severely restricting the autonomy of the provincial party organizations. Second, replacing Montenegro's existing political leadership with a nationalistic one that supported Milošević, in which and other memorandum written by Montenegrin academic Vlado Strugar played a role. And thirdly, undermining the existing federalist structure of Yugoslavia in favor of a more centralized arrangement in which the principle of proportional representation or one man, one vote would replace the existing federal units-based arrangement, where the decisions were made through Republican Party organizations and in which each autonomous Republican unit carried as much power as each other, regardless of the size of the population. Highly public and media-supported boycott of Slovenian goods ensued in Serbia. Economic warfare between Serbia and Slovenia ensued, each republic's press and politicians accusing the other of ripping off the other, Serbs claiming that the Slovenians were getting too good of a deal on raw materials and agricultural products from Serbia for their successful industrialization and pulling ahead of the rest of the country, Slovenians complaining of having to pull the dead weight of lazy southerners by federal transfers to poorer provinces such as Serbia. This is the atmosphere that led up to the 14th Congress of the League of Communists of Yugoslavia. Milošević arrived to the 14th Irregular Party Congress in 1990, and what turned out to be the last Congress of Yugoslav Communist League, armed with control of 4 out of 8 party organization votes and the numerical majority of delegates. Slovenian delegation's 28 amendments, whose aim was to transform the federation into a more loosely based one with greater autonomy for republics, was voted down by the Serbian majority, after which the entire Slovenian delegation left the Congress. Milošević suggested that the work of the Congress continue without the Slovenians, but the Croatian and Macedonian delegations refused. The Congress was ended with an agreement that they will be reconvened at a later date. That never happened. That was the end of the United Yugoslavia and the end of the Yugoslavian League of Communists.
Ivan, before I let you continue, where's Tito in all of this? Did Tito pass away before the rise of Slobodan Milošević?
Yeah. Tito died in 1980.
Wow, that's okay. Okay, wow. I didn't realize that he died so early during that stage of the Cold War with the Reagan era.
Thanks for the yeah, you know who was at the funeral?
No.
Everyone was at the funeral.
Yeah.
Including Maggie Thatcher, man. Yeah, Margaret Thatcher was at the funeral. Wow. Thank you for pointing that out, because that's missing from the story and shouldn't be, you know.
Alrighty. So we're in the 90s. The rise of Slobodan Milošević.
That's 85. Like, we're basically 85 to 90 now.
Okay. So continue. Multi-party elections, rise of fascism, secession, and war. Continue.
Each Republican delegation went home and set out to organize the first multi-party bourgeois parliamentary elections, after which each republic was to write its own new constitution, to be followed by an election to the Federal Assembly. Croatia and Slovenia held their elections in haste in the summer of 1991, and both elected nationalistic pro-capitalist governments, which soon after their elections called referendums on sovereignty, which returned overwhelming majorities in favor of secession. Slovenia declared independence first on June 25th, to which Yugoslavian People's Army responded by sending troops in to secure borders. The troops were unwilling to actually carry out a serious operation, and many were sent in unarmed. No one really cared about Slovenia leaving, to be honest. Serbs, crucially, didn't care. There was no Serbian or any other, for that matter, minority living in Slovenia in significant numbers. The republic was more than 90% ethnically pure. It was always highly developed and more akin to Western European countries in terms of living standard and economy. The few minorities that existed within Slovenia did not feel threatened. They felt like they were entering Western Europe, which in effect is what they were doing. Due to the short duration, only 10 days, and low intensity of the war, casualties were not high. According to Slovenian estimates, Yugoslavian People's Army suffered 44 fatalities and 146 were wounded, while the Slovenians had 19 killed and 182 wounded. A huge precedent was set, however. Yugoslavia's territorial integrity was cracked. It set the ball of wreckage rolling. Croatia declared its independence on the same day as Slovenia, but its road to putting that decision into effect was not as easy, to say the least. Croatia's president Franjo Tudjman, the leader of Croatian Democratic Union, was perfectly placed to effect what he and most other nationalists, beginning with the leader of the notorious wartime independent state of Croatia, Ante Pavelić, believed needed to be effected, namely Croatian unity and an end to schism between Croatian communists and fascists, a movement of Croatian unity with the common aim of ending what they considered to be Serbian oppression and forming a sovereign state. Tudjman was uniquely positioned to carry out this task, as he had the history of being both Tito's friend and a loyal soldier, having fought as a partisan against fascists in Tito's army, and then subsequently becoming a youngest general in Yugoslav People's Army, and a dissident who participated in the 1971 Croatian Spring as a historian, and served some jail time for that. His contribution to the nationalist uprising had to do with the snide anti-Semitic comments, one to do with rumors that his wife was Jewish or Serbian, to which he responded with, "I wish they were. That would make me a rich man," and his downplaying of the extent of the Holocaust against Jews and Serbs. His shtick was correcting numbers downwards rather than outright denying the genocide, most famously in his 1989 Bespuće povijesne zbiljnosti, which translates as Horrors of War, Historical Reality and Philosophy. For Jews, he claimed that only 4 million were killed rather than the commonly accepted number of 6 million. According to him, this is a quote, the Jews spoke envy and hatred, but actually they were the unhappiest nation in the world, always victims of their own and others' ambitions, and whoever tries to show that they're themselves their own source of tragedy is ranked among the anti-Semites and the object of hatred by the Jews. Correcting the outlandish claims, mainly for the purpose of extracting more war reparations of the then Yugoslav administration that 700,000 Serbs were killed in the Ustaša concentration camp Jasenovac, Tudjman pulled the other way and claimed that the camp was a work camp and that no more than 40,000 victims met their fate there, more Jews and Roma than Serbs. The actual number appeared to be around 100,000, of whom majority were Serbs. He placed the number of Serbs killed during the war in independent state of Croatia at 50,000, when in fact more than 300,000 were killed, over 200 of them civilians. Much of his popularity came from his close relationship with the Croatian fascist diaspora. Namely, he made frequent trips to Western Europe throughout the 70s and 80s, with the most important one being to Canada in 1987, during which he finally satisfied the skeptical Croatian Canadian Nazis that he is no longer Tito's general and is in fact loyal to the Ustaši project. The pact was solidified by Tudjman's taking on one of them, an Ottawa pizza maker Gojko Šušak, as his Minister of Defense, and making all kinds of allowances for the despotic influence over the newly envisioned state. Tudjman made public statements meant to revise the historical memory of the independent state of Croatia in his speeches on the election trail. Most famously at the Congress of his party, when he stated the independent state of Croatia, quote, wasn't just simply a Quisling project and a fascist atrocity, but also an expression of political aspirations of Croatian people for their own sovereign state, as well as an understanding of the international factors, in this case, the power of Hitler's Germany. While Tudjman himself never explicitly threatened the Serbs with genocide, many like Šušak in Tudjman's administration did. New, armed by the fascist diaspora, paramilitary units brandished Ustaša insignia and shouted Ustaša slogans, calling for an outright annihilation of Serbs, which was always their primary political program, above even Croatian independence as such. The checkered white and red coat of arms, which replaced the red star in the middle of the white field of the, from top to bottom, red, white, and blue Croatian flag of the fascist independent state of Croatia, was altered slightly, but not enough for either the Serbs or the Croats to mistake it for something other than the symbol under which 200,000 Serbian civilians were exterminated during the Second World War.
And is that the current flag of Croatia currently right now?
Yes. The difference between the flag of the independent state of Croatia, the fascist independent state of Croatia in the Second World War, and the current one, is that the checkered fields in the middle on the Nazi state one start with a white field, and in the current one they start with a red field. So like the top corner, the corners are red rather than white, and the current flag has some crests, small crests, five of them I think, going over that checkered middle. But really, as I said, somewhat different, but not different enough. After Croats voted for independence from Yugoslavia in the referendum that Croatian Serbs boycotted, and just as he was about to declare independence, Tudjman offered Serbian minority a vice president position and cultural autonomy within the new independent state of Croatia. We'll never know how genuine his offer was, because the Serbs in the Serb-dominated area of Croatia went ahead and held their own referendum in response and declared themselves an independent republic within the now rump Yugoslavia, which included Yugoslavia, Montenegro, Bosnia, and Macedonia. The latter of two which were immediately to leave, imminently soon to leave. Organized the Serbs in Croatia organized their own territorial defense militias, guns for which were supplied by the Yugoslav People's Army, which was until recently the fourth largest army in Europe, which was now deserted itself by most soldiers not of Serbian nationality, although Serbs weren't far behind. The lines were drawn, and the skirmishes between the Yugoslavian National Army and Republic Serbian Krajina on the one hand, and the Croatian military grew into an all-out war over the course of 1991. Militarily superior Serbs liberated areas of Croatia in which they were the majority, and then some, most famously the northern town of Vukovar, which is still remembered for having the best pizza I've ever tried to this day, of which there was literally nothing left but a pile of rubble when the Serbian troops took over. The situation was stabilized with that decisive battle, and a kind of ceasefire ensured for a few years. Serbs held their territory, and Croats couldn't take it. The so-called UN peacekeepers kept them separated. The war theater moved over to the neighboring Bosnia. Bosnians, too, their republic hitherto understood to be mini Yugoslavia and immune to ethnic hatreds that seemed to have grabbed the hold of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenians, who held demonstrations proclaiming brotherhood and unity and loyalty to Tito's way, chose to vote along ethnic lines and for national parties, and returned the parliament divided exactly as was divided the confessional composition of the republic. A little more than 40% voted for the Islamic Party of Democratic Action. A little more than 30% declared themselves for Serbian Democratic Party, and a little less than 20% chose the Bosnian version of Tudjman's Croatian Democratic Union. The favorite in the pre-election polls, pro-Yugoslavian party of the liberalizing reformist Prime Minister Ante Marković, was routed. People got scared that if they voted for Yugoslavs, the people of other ethnic groups will vote for their guys and win the majority. Croats and Muslims formed a coalition and declared the Islamist leader of Bosnian Muslims, Alija Izetbegović, the president of the republic, and after the referendum on independence that Serbs again boycotted, but Muslims and Croats voted in favor of, declared Bosnia a sovereign state. Same as in Croatia, Serbs, aka Yugoslav People's Army, rose up in rebellion and declared an independent Serbian state within Bosnia. They started cleansing their territories of Croats and Muslims, besieging Sarajevo, and started shelling. Muslims and Croats did the same to them in the territories that they ended up controlling, but soon turned on each other, and in fact ended up killing more of each other than the Serbs. United Nations tried to keep peace, but also tried to help the official Bosnian government resist what they now called Serb aggression, implying that the Serbs were foreigners who came from elsewhere and occupied parts of someone else's country, which was not the case, and get supplies through to the mostly Muslim and Croatian civilians who indeed needed it most, having been encircled and blocked off from all goods within UN-protected enclaves such as Sarajevo and the infamous Srebrenica. Muslim army used the UN protection to attack Serbian positions and terrorize Serbian villages around these protected enclaves, and even orchestrated attacks against their own civilians in order to hasten the Western intervention on their behalf. One of these staged massacres, a bombing of an open-air market called Markale in Sarajevo, resulted in the desired outcome, and NATO airplanes started bombing Serbian positions in support of the Western armed Bosnian and Croatian ground troop offensive that finally brought the Bosnian Serbs to the table, thus ending the Bosnian War. Serbs ended up with nearly 50% of the territory and a de facto state within a state, thus making up for having lost their territories in Croatia a few months earlier in another American armed and trained an aerial bombardment supported operation of the Croatian army, in which 200,000 Serbs were kicked out of Croatia, thus reducing the percentage of Serbs as a part of Croatia from 12% to 4%. Pavelić's dream of ethnically pure independent state of Croatia was finally realized. About 250,000 Serbs who lived in the Socialist Federal Republic of Croatia do not live in the Republic of Croatia. About 20,000 people, 13,000 Croats and 7,000 Serbs, lost their lives in the Croatian War of Independence. The big losers in Bosnia were Bosnian Muslims and their unfortunate leader, who for some crazy reason didn't realize that with military aid unlikely to come from the only remaining superpower well known for its hatred of Muslims, he had no chance of winning a war which he knew had to happen as soon as he declared Bosnia independent, with nearly half of its population opposing it, and encircled by two larger state entities, the Serbian and the Croatian one. Out of about 100,000 dead, 63,000 were Bosnian Muslims, roughly half of them civilians, which made up 80% of all civilians killed in the war. 30,000 Bosnian Muslim women were systematically raped in Serbian rape camps, and 8,000 Bosnian men were executed in one day near Srebrenica after the Bosnian Serb army took possession of the UN-protected enclave. 87% of all the atrocities in Bosnia were committed by Serbs who finally got their revenge for World War II and 500 years of Ottoman rule. There is a debate over whether or not the execution of 8,000 men near Srebrenica constitutes an act of genocide or just an atrocity and a war crime. Some, who having nothing nicer to look forward to being citizens of a country that hardly qualifies as a country occupied and administered as a protectorate and a colony, are fighting for a genocide designation and dreaming of a day when they'll exact their revenge on Serbian civilians. Those dreams will only go away when a society of abundance is finally achieved. And for those kinds of dreams, they are showing signs of life finally as well.
Wow.
Let me read that again. Just the last paragraph. Bosnians too. Their republic hitherto understood to be mini Yugoslavia and immune to ethnic hatred. No. Sorry. Okay. Here. The big losers in Bosnia were Bosnian Muslims and their unfortunate leader, who for some crazy reason didn't realize that with military aid unlikely to come from the only remaining superpower well known for its hatred of Muslims, he had no chance of winning a war, which he knew had to happen as soon as he declared Bosnia independent, with nearly half of its population opposing it and encircled by two larger state entities, the Serbian and the Croatian one. Out of about 100,000 dead, 63,000 were Bosnian Muslims, roughly half of them civilians, which made up 80% of all civilians killed in the war. 30,000 Bosnian Muslim women were systematically raped in Serbian rape camps, and 8,000 Bosnian men were executed in one day near Srebrenica after the Bosnian Serb army took possession of the UN-protected enclave. 87% of all atrocities in Bosnia were committed by Serbs who finally got their revenge for World War II and 500 years of Ottoman rule. There is a debate over whether or not the execution of 8,000 men near Srebrenica constitutes an act of genocide or just an atrocity and a war crime. Some who, having nothing nicer to look forward to being citizen of a country that hardly qualifies as a country occupied and administered as a protectorate and a colony, are fighting for a genocide designation and dreaming of a day when they'll exact their revenge on Serbian civilians. Those dreams will only go away when a society of abundance is finally achieved. As for those kinds of dreams, they're showing signs of life finally as well.
Wow.
Milošević's speech at Kosovo Polje is often cited as the beginning of the end of Yugoslavia. The speech has two parts. The first part is Serbian nationalistic, containing veiled threats to the enemies of the Serbian nation and boasting about how brave the Serbs are. There's an eerie moment in this first part of the speech when he talks about how Serbs never shied away from battle and how there are battles before them that are not of the military kind, And this is a quote, although those should not be excluded either. This is the part the Western scholars like to quote as evidence that Milošević is a nationalist maniac akin to Hitler and a monster, butcher of the Balkans, and such. The second part of the speech was most famously quoted by Ramsey Clark as evidence that he was in fact a reasonable socialist who believed in multiculturalism and Yugoslavian model of brotherhood and unity. Indeed, here Milošević warns the crowd against ethnic hatred and nationalism and calls for ethnic and national tolerance and continued construction of socialism. It's a little Jekyll and Hyde-esque indeed, if you're looking for a clear-cut reading. In the context of the time, the first nationalist part was indeed shocking. Such nationalist sentiments have not been heard from the mouth of Yugoslavian communist politicians before. Milošević indeed represented that nationalist stream in the Serbian and Yugoslavian communism, a kind of thinking that was indeed incompatible with Yugoslavia's brand of communism. It clashed with the first principle of our brand of socialism, with the idea of brotherhood and unity, and the idea that it was the duty of communists to first and foremost oppose the nationalists within their own nation. He did indeed win out against comrades who rejected and denounced the glorification of the Serbian nation and the revival of the old nationalist fables. He built up to this event with many others in which he used similarly clear nationalist sentiments. For a communist, for Yugoslavian communists, this was unheard of and outrageous. But it wasn't outrageous for a nationalist in general. On a spectrum of ethnic nationalists, he was indeed a very mild case. To dismiss the other part as meaningless is incorrect as well, I think. Again, I think we should take people's words more seriously. For the most part, they say what they mean and believe. There is certainly a degree of manipulation in politicians, but assuming that they're always driven by greed or personal ambition, which is another very common interpretation of Milošević, that was just using nationalist sentiments that was in the air in order to grab a hold of power and become a dictator, is probably the most primitive and idiotic way of reading history. The interpretation that makes most sense, I think, is that he was indeed a socialist and a nationalist, a Serbian socialist who indeed believed in a multi-ethnic socialist Serbia, who believed in socialism, but also in a better deal for Serbs, who believed that Serbs got screwed in Yugoslavia and should be able to renegotiate the deal. If it turns out that others didn't want to get along, or if they wanted to leave, then he was confident that the Serbs could hold their own in an unfortunate conflict. No, I'm just, hold on.
Okay. No problem.
There's a little more sophisticated way to read the situation. It would be to lay the troubles. There is a little more sophisticated reading of what happened, and it is to place the beginning of troubles at the feet of the memorandum and the consequent awakening of the Serbian people or anti-bureaucratic revolution. This, in my opinion, is unfair as well, as it is completely arbitrary and should not be considered in isolation for the events that preceded it and that it was responding to. Why not place the beginning in 1981, when Albanians demanded independence from Serbia for Kosovo, or in 1971, when Croatian intellectuals outlined a very similar set of grievances to those in the Serbian memorandum, only on behalf of a Croatian nation? The real question is, what is it that made this particular nationalist uprising stick and turn into a civil war? And what was it that made it so that the previous ones were weathered by the socialist state? After all the anti-socialist and anti-Yugoslav forces that came to the fore in the late 1980s, the fascist diaspora, the Western imperialists, the domestic nationalists and opportunists, were all there all along since the Second World War. What was it that made Milošević able to take over the Serbian Republican party apparatus at the time, while similar movements in the past have been stopped in their tracks, is the question that needs to be answered. Was he more charismatic than previous contenders? No, he really wasn't. His speeches were pretty boring. He actually eschewed limelight. Were the Serbs more nationalistic than the other Yugoslavian nations? Not really. They seem to have taken turns. Serbs were quiet when Croats rose up in the early 70s. Albanians in the 80s, while Albanians and Croats kept quiet while Milošević was happening. What was it, after all, that allowed for the people to happen? That will be the subject of my final section here. I'll just hint here that the answer might have something to do with the famous phrase uttered by Bill Clinton's campaign strategist James Carville in 1992. It's the economy, stupid. In 1975, Tito went to visit Kosovo, and this is what he said. He said, preaching brotherhood and unity in Kosovo is not enough if there's no material basis for it. We have to do everything we can so that Kosovo is developed quicker. Susan Woodward, who wrote 2 very good books about Yugoslavia, and who I've relied on for some of the sections of this, said this: in a period of prolonged severe recession, it is difficult to contain people's search for scapegoats. And finally, Tony Blair, the British Prime Minister, during the NATO aggression against Serbia in 1999.
And war criminal at large.
War criminal at large, indeed. The war against the Serbs, he said, is no longer just a military conflict. It is a battle between good and evil, between civilization and barbarism. It's the economic crisis that is at the root of the discontent of the people that gave them the impetus to rise up against the political regime. The anti-bureaucratic revolution started as a series of strikes in response to the loss of purchasing power of the workers' wages. The infamous Serbian Academy of Arts and Sciences memorandum is full of economic grievances having to do with the underdevelopment of Serbia in relation to Croatia and Slovenia. Indeed, Croatian, Albanian, Slovenian, and all nationalist grievances were, at their base and explicitly, always economic. They were also, in a sick dialectical twist of fate, all correct. Serbia was indeed underdeveloped compared to Slovenia, and Slovenia was indeed held back by Serbia insofar as the more developed provinces continued to enjoy the higher standard of living than the less developed one. Slovenian industry, for example, benefited from Serbian raw materials and markets, but so did Serbian agriculture, and extractive industries benefit from the preferential prices they were getting from Slovenian purchasers. The uneven development gap persisted, but all enjoyed the benefits of growth. When the economic crisis befell the country, all felt it just as much. What happened in Yugoslavia was a part and parcel of what was happening across the communist world, a crisis of accumulation caused by the neoliberal turn in the institutions of the global monetary and banking regime, namely in the terms and conditions of the World Bank and International Monetary Fund. But while this theory explains why communism fell and capitalism triumphed, it does not explain why Yugoslavia's version of transition resulted in a bloody civil war. As far as transition to capitalism is concerned, Yugoslavia was leading the way. At the turn of the 1990s, Yugoslavia was in the best possible position to make the transition to the capitalist economy. It had had a very long and cordial relationship with the IMF and the World Bank. It had an established market economy embedded in the capitalist world market, and it had a very formist and very popular state leadership. Yugoslavia was, in a sense, halfway there already and way ahead of other Eastern European countries by any economic measure, including the most important one, that market mechanism within and without that other socialist countries were only beginning to experiment with in the 1980s. And herein lies the key to understanding the tragedy. In addition to the almost natural to capitalism turn to conspiracy and ethnic belonging, racism, hatred, and scapegoating of minorities in the times of economic crisis, Yugoslavia had a little extra oomph on that front. Not only was there the not-so-distant memory of ethnic cleansing and genocide in the Second World War, the First World War and the Balkan Wars immediately preceding it, and the corresponding still fresh desire for revenge, but Yugoslavian market economy itself had an embedded self-destruction mechanism ready to be triggered at any point. namely Yugoslavia's drive towards independence from its Soviet orbit, forced it not only into the military alliance with the US-led forces, but also into an economic arms of the Western alliance. In fact, the fact that Yugoslavia sought to maintain its military equidistance between two powers rather than relying on Western protection meant that it continued to spend an exorbitant amount of money on the military, money that it sought to find in the elimination of the unproductive sector of the economy, namely the bureaucratic sector. This was the real impetus behind Yugoslavian paradoxical top-down workers' self-management. Yugoslavian economic ideologues figured that by giving the workers the stake in the economy, by letting them run their own workplaces, they'll kill two birds with one stone. On the one hand, they will turn them from workers into managers, and that way change their outlook on their role in society from workerist outlook, which would impel them to fight for higher wages, and against their employers, which in this case is the state, to a managerial outlook. What's best for the firm? How can we all work together to be more productive and raise our collective wage fund or grow? And on the other hand, streamline production by cutting out the bureaucrats and administrators. A further twist to this anti-bureaucratic drive was the decentralization of the governing structures, so that the state, beginning with the central federal state, would slowly wither away. It was also not accidental that the anti-bureaucratic revolution, which doubled as happening of the Serbian people, took the form that it did. Anti-bureaucratic impulse was from the very beginning in the DNA of Yugoslavs. The market economy which socialist Yugoslavia had was the highly decentralized kind that combined worker self-management, aka politically heavy invested workers in the enterprises that were embedded in the republican structures of governance, and as part of those in the capitalist world market. The workers' interest, that is, was intertwined with the capitalist market, and their the workers' interest, that is, was intertwined with the capitalist market, and their republics as units within that market. To win in Yugoslav economy meant to win a foreign contract with a Western buyer for your firm over a firm from another republic, or to win a cheaper price for raw materials coming from a less developed republic, or vice versa. While a socialist man in Russia or Poland was loyal to his country or his class, to the worldwide socialist movement, and maybe even the great Stalin or Moscow, Yugoslav socialist man was a man loyal to the market, to his firm and to his republic, just as much he was loyal to Tito in Yugoslavia. Tito was long gone, and Yugoslavia was never pitted against Croatia or Serbia. Yugoslavia always encouraged them in one way or another, always avoiding that final battle. Also, Western powers no longer had any use for unified Yugoslavia with its huge market and stubborn and feisty leadership. Americans tolerated Tito's third way, an opposition to both blocs, but would have much preferred him to completely turn and become a part of NATO. Now that the Russian threat was neutralized, there was no need for an anti-Soviet mini superpower in the Balkans. Now, the American agenda changed. Divided and Balkanized, the little Balkan countries were a lot more likely to turn into banana republics in the mold of Central American right-wing dictatorships that Americans loved so much. Germany much preferred an inferior and subservient little Croatia as its Adriatic outpost, and the severing of that integrated Yugoslav market, where industrialized Slovenia and Croatia had both a source of raw materials and goods and a market for the finished product behind the tariff wall. Ethnic Germans were already the vast majority of tourists on the Adriatic coast, enjoying for them dirt cheap accommodation, entertainment, and natural beauty. But they couldn't own the hotels, bus lines, restaurants, and villas, and they had to mingle with the Yugoslavia's own tourists, who could also afford to colonize the coast themselves for a few months in the summer. The German capital was salivating at the mouth at the prospect of buying up the arguably most beautiful coastline in the world. Socialist Yugoslavia was virtually from its inception embedded in the capitalist market and dependent on Western loans for its functioning. It was as such subject to all the fluctuations and earthquakes of the world market, and when the crisis of productivity arrived in the 70s, it was only the new loans and renegotiation of the terms of the existing loans that was keeping the economy from collapsing. When the federal government accepted the hardcore structural adjustment programs in the late 1980s and carried it out to a T, And when it, as a factor of unity and the only hope for Yugoslavia to remain a country, was expecting a funding package that would vastly boost its standing above and against all the little and helpless and devoid of any socio-economic program nationalist Republican administrations, the United States and EU, which at the same time approved massive aid packages for the reforming Poland, Czech Republic, and Hungary, said no. They caused the massive unemployment and inflation in the late 1980s, and then they refused to stop the bleeding. They pulled the rug from under the feet of Yugoslavia. It's as if they waited for this moment forever, as if they waited to finally tell Tito, here, how do you like being neither west nor east now? Now you aren't even in the middle. Burn, motherfucker, burn. Indeed, the debate over what to do with Yugoslavia has raged inside the walls of the Pentagon for decades, with one, mostly associated with Republicans wing, pulling for the Serbs, and the other, mostly associated with the Democrats, taking the side of the Croats and Albanians. But more importantly, and across those camps, the debate was centered between those who prevailed for the most part, who strategically supported Tito and his neutrality as a factor of stability and a buffer against the Soviets, and those who saw him as a dangerous supporter of the Third World rebels and a Russian man, and who wanted him and his anti-colonial communist project crushed. When Bill Clinton came to power at the beginning of the unfolding of the Yugoslav tragedy, he saw the situation through a double anti-Serbian lens. Seeing Milošević as an old-fashioned socialist who sought to continue in the footsteps of Tito as a strongman at the helm of Yugoslavia, he also saw him as an oppressor of the pro-Western Catholic Croat and Slovene minorities. His democratic bias against Serbs doubled up with his hatred for maverick communism of the Titoist kind. Now that the debate over whether Yugoslavia is useful or not in the battle against Soviet Union was over, there was no reason to keep it together or to tolerate some loose cannon strongmen in the middle of NATO-occupied Europe. Milošević thought that he'll get a break after getting the Bosnian Serbs to stop fighting and achieving the peace in Bosnia. Instead, he got intensified sanctions and an armed uprising of the Albanians in Kosovo, and ultimately a coward revolution.
Yeah.
Having realized that there is no pleasing the West, Milošević rediscovered his socialism in the late 1990s and actually started making overtures to China and courting some of the eccentric Western leftists like Michael Parenti and Peter Hanke.
We're gonna return to that we're gonna return to that in a later interview on the subject of Yugoslavia.
he started talking about imperialism again, and his wife started gathering around prominent figures of the pre-1990s communist left into a party called United Yugoslav Left. At the same time, he continued his cooperation with the extreme patriotic right, continuing to outflank the neoliberal Western-funded opposition, which suffered from obvious ties to the imperialist aggressor who bombed the Serbs out of Croatia and out of a big chunk of what they conquered in Bosnia. Now these foreign mercenaries were cheering on NATO bombs raining down on Serbia. CIA started arming and training Kosovo Liberation Army and promoting it over a peaceful resistance of Ibrahim Rugova, who had a parallel governance structure going in Kosovo, even after Milošević took over the provincial parliament in 1991. KLA started terrorizing Serbian police forces and civilians in Kosovo and provoking military engagement. Clashes escalated with Serbian forces securing the territory. Western NGO networks, Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, recorded horror stories of Albanians who claimed that there was a genocide going on, which was not the case. Tony Blair and Bill Clinton, famous for their respect for human rights across the non-neoliberal countries worldwide, put together a conference to resolve the humanitarian crisis. Rambouillet agreement was an ultimatum that Serbia couldn't accept. It postulated NATO military occupation of the entire country of Serbia. Milošević brought the agreement back to the Serbian parliament for approval, and no one voted in favor of accepting it. This resulted in the first government of national unity that included all political parties in Serbia. The unity was short-lived, however, as was the war Serbian military and paramilitaries that included units made up of released criminals were set loose on the KLA and Albanian civilians, most of whom fled to the neighboring Macedonia, where they were greeted by the compassionate gaze of the Western liberal press and settled in refugee camps for a little while until NATO destroyed enough Serbian infrastructure and threatened to turn Belgrade into a carpet after almost 2.5 months of constant bombing. Russia was under the Yeltsin regime then. It agreed to American demands and refused to support Serbia with weapons or diplomacy. Yeltsin's second in charge, Russia's prime minister and the U.S. favorite to succeed Yeltsin, Viktor Chernomyrdin, was appointed as a special representative of Russia in Yugoslavia at the behest of Americans. He told Milošević that he was on his own. Milošević folded. He gave up Kosovo to NATO occupation, but kept the Americans out of the rest of Serbia, which gave him some credibility in claiming that he saved the country and won the war. Some of us wished he would live up to his billing of crazed warmonger and fight on, engage, that is NATO ground troops and guerrilla combat, until the end. But alas, always the moderate, Milošević backed off and saved the Serbs from deaths. 8,600 Albanians are still unaccounted for, although some mass graves are turning up. 90%
during the war.
Yeah, 90% during the war. 1,600 to 2,500 Serbs are dead or missing. Milošević claimed that people were running away from bombardment. Western leftists, so-called leftists, claimed that bombing made it worse by encouraging Milošević to ethnically cleanse the territory of Albanians by killing and expelling them. Bourdieu, Said, and Chomsky had a solution that no one gave a fuck about. Many on the Western left, even though only a few admitted it, started to look at Milošević with a little more respect than previously in light of his apparent anti-imperialist resistance. Why was it that Americans and the British hated him so much? Maybe he was indeed some kind of socialist like he claimed he was. Yours truly got excited too, and has ended his speech at some of the very large, impressive, and internationalist anti-war rallies in Toronto with shouts of "Long live Slobodan Milošević." I guess he desperately wanted a hero. Between Milošević's change in tune and my own nostalgia for the real socialist option, in addition to anti-imperialism, I got a little excited and dreamed up a scenario in which Milošević leads the Serbs to victory against NATO, and in the process galvanizes the rest of Yugoslavs to stand up and fight themselves and revive the old Yugoslavia. Indeed, the first signs of solidarity were appearing, with Croatian and Slovenian voices speaking out against the aggression against Yugoslavia. Kosovo was occupied by NATO troops, and the largest military base in Europe was erected there, but Serbia remained independent, with Milošević the elected president at the helm. His unity government quickly dissolved, however, with most of the liberal opposition back in the Western fold. A new, cool movement called Otpor, meaning resistance, was developed and branded in the CIA National Endowment for Democracy laboratory and gathered the pro-Western intellectuals with book deals and fellowships ready to go as soon as the job was done. One of them, Srđa Popović, has made a career of developing and promoting counter-revolutions, appearing in various Western documentaries, and having written the U.S. Congress-funding anarchist primer, Nonviolent Struggle, 50 Crucial Points. Less than a year and a half after the bombing ended, Milošević was overthrown in a popular uprising after the first round election results were rejected by the now united opposition with the promise of Western aid and lifting of sanctions and NATO troops ready on the borders to invade in the case of an undesirable outcome of the elections. With state security apparatus turning on him, Milošević conceded victory to the Western-backed opposition ticket. Soon after, he was arrested and delivered by the neoliberal regime in Belgrade to the International Tribunal for War Crimes in former Yugoslavia. There he joined other members of his coalition and leaders of Bosnian Serb armed forces. International Tribunal for War Crimes in former Yugoslavia was an ad hoc court that all parties agreed to in the Dayton Agreement that ended the Bosnian War. They didn't think twice about it when they signed the papers. It did not occur to them that this will be a place where everyone involved will end up. Dayton was a blueprint for perpetual occupation and ethnic tension, with outcomes of ethnic cleansing legitimized, and the guarantee that the national question will remain in the forefront for years to come. The show trials served both as a way for Western victors to prosecute any and all patriotic nationalist or anti-Western leaders in former Yugoslavia, many of whom were indeed perpetrators of gruesome war crimes and even genocide, and as another pulpit for some of those figures to promote their nationalist agenda. Most famously, the leader of Serbian Radical Party, Vojislav Šešelj, who famously stated that Croats should be slaughtered with rusted spoons, got to publicly present now to the whole world his theories of Serbian ethnic supremacy and calls for a greater Serbia. Milošević tried to use his own trial to put Western leaders like Bill Clinton and Tony Blair on trial for an illegal and undeclared war in Serbia, but didn't manage to finish the job, as his health, combined with some sketchy doings of the prison staff to deny the man proper medical attention, failed him. He died in Hague on March 11, 2006. Even though most of the victims of International Tribunal for War Crimes in former Yugoslavia were Serbs, as is appropriate given the fact that the Serbs committed the great majority of crimes in the wars of the 1990s, many of the accused were not Serbs. The role of the tribunal, contrary to the popular opinion promoted by the majority of its victims, was not to put Serbs on trial, but to legitimize the Western intervention and occupation of former Yugoslavia. The entire anti-Western leadership of all Yugoslav nations has been put on trial here, and the message was sent to the rest of the non-cooperation. The message was sent to the rest that non-cooperation with the so-called international community will not be tolerated, even though the official mandate of the tribunal is to punish crimes committed by all parties on the territory of former Yugoslavia, NATO invasion and bombing, as well as training of fascist forces in Croatia and Kosovo, has, of course, gone unpunished. Peace wasn't going to be peace, just like transition was never going to be a transition. Peace and capitalism came in the form of occupation and humiliation and a constant reminder of your vassal status. A poverty economies with massive unemployment and brutal Wild West capitalism, where everything worth anything is owned by foreign companies, and the small comprador class is only thriving under the condition that it visibly bows down to the real bosses, if and when they choose to grace us with their presence. More people have left former Yugoslavia since the peace has been restored than during the wars. The countries are way ethnically purer than they were ever before, and there's seemingly no end to further nationalist solutions to what are glaringly obviously economic and social problems. Kosovo and Bosnia, books remain open, both leaving room for further degrees of separation. Bosnia remaining officially a unified state with two entities, one ethnically pure Serb, another in which Croats and Bosniaks are supposed to live together, with a further tiny canton which separates or unifies two parts of the Serbian-dominated region belonging to nobody. Needless to say, Serbian politicians have been trying to take that canton over and declare independence from the federation ever since. Meanwhile, Croatian politicians have not given up on carving out Croatia's own piece of Bosnia and adding it to the ethnically pure Croatia. Similarly, Kosovo is occupied by NATO forces and recognized as an independent state by most Western countries, but a small number of Serbs still live there and threaten to carve out a piece of it and add it to Serbia. Some Albanians see no point in Kosovo being a separate entity from Albania. In any case, there is plenty of national questions to occupy the starving masses and ensure that there is no talk of socialism or workers' rights. Unfortunately, the left is no better off on the territory of former Yugoslavia than it is in the rest of Europe. The defeat of communism has ushered in a period of leftist impotence, and by that I mean anarchism and various other attempts to invent new leftist solutions that are not the supposedly failed communism they lost in the 90s. Much of the left has been co-opted by the Western NGOs, which are really good which are really good in endowing any and all attempts to resist neoliberalism with funding that takes it in some kind of identitarian or otherwise non-threatening to capital direction. Anti-imperialism has been populated by the right and the traditional left in Serbia, i.e. Milošević's Socialist Party has been compromised by its seemingly unbreakable allegiance with the darkest of right-wing forces, while in Croatia and Slovenia it has long ago morphed into a typical neoliberal social democracy. All roads seem to lead into the wall. Behind anti-imperialism is fascism, behind socialism neoliberalism. General sentiment amongst the people, which is that Yugoslavia was a million times better than this, and that the return of old Yugoslavia would be great, is not finding reception in actual political organization. Serbs in Bosnia are unwilling to give up the ethnically pure state that they won, so that when there's an uprising in the multi-ethnic part of Bosnia that raises the specter of Yugoslavian socialism and brotherhood and unity, as happened in 2014, there is no echo among the Serbs. Croats are also happy with their ethnically pure Croatia and will hear nothing about Serbs being oppressed or solidarity with them. Kosovars would rather leave the failed state of Kosovo, where youth unemployment is over 40%, never to return than fight for a common socialist home that they had with Serbs. Indeed, leaving appears to be the main order of business. Of course, the Western experience is not rosy either, and the days of making it in the West are as far away as are the days of having it good in Yugoslavia are. Shit cleaning and construction jobs are aplenty in Germany and the United States, but the rents are high and surviving compares very unfavorably to what we had in Yugoslavia. I've been involved with a small group of Yugoslavs in diaspora, mostly leftist academics, over the last few years or so, and we've been meeting and organizing forums and discussion groups and dreaming up ways to get more involved back home. What we realized recently is that the old clear line of separation between diaspora and mother country has faded, especially in our case, as our country has been parceled out into pieces that we don't consider ours. We've always realized that we have a lot in common with not only other progressive diasporic organizations that have been active and strong, like the Palestinian organizations and various Latin American ones, but also our enemies, fascist Serbian and Croatian diaspora, who very successfully organized to intervene back home and bring their agenda to the fore. We recognize that there is enough of wandering in the deserts of anarchism and neoliberalism, Western-style leftism that replaces socialism with expressions of individuality and creative solutions that make us feel better about being poor and hungry. We're plotting to bring back Yugoslavia, brotherhood and unity, socialism on the agenda, and of all the occupied nations of former Yugoslavia. We're plotting to bring back what actually works, what has actually worked in the past. We're plotting to repeat the past. When what happened in Yugoslavia in the 90s, when what happened in Yugoslavia in the 90s, most of us saw it as a unique, perhaps akin to what happened in Rwanda at that moment, or the second referendum in Quebec on a smaller scale moment that was just a blip on an otherwise steady rise of neoliberal consensus, something that can be isolated in time and place, some unfinished business that Serbs and Croats specifically had with each other, some atavistic and anachronistic vampires awakening from their slumber, but soon burned by the sun of bourgeois democracy that shone everywhere else and will forever. But then Le Pen came, and Trump, and Bolsonaro, and Orban, and they started making all the arguments that we heard before in Yugoslavia in the 1990s. Mm-hmm. They brought back fascism just like we did in Yugoslavia. And they're not going away, like Tudjman and Milošević ultimately went away under the boot of the almighty humanitarian NATO force, the former only saved from the latter's fate of dying in a Western prison by his own stomach cancer catching up with him. They're here to stay as a permanent fixture and a constant specter of fascism, which is always there as long as there is capitalism to inject it with life when it falters under its own contradictions. They're here not to threaten the capitalist neoliberal order or its imperialist projects, nor are the liberal establishments there to stop fascism. On the contrary, if we've learned anything from the long history of the Southern Slavs, it is that there is only one cure for fascism, and that it is socialism. And it is not a permanent cure, just like it's not a permanent cure to capitalism either. It's an option that sometimes arises in the middle of the fucking bloodbath and amidst smoke and rubble of Paris or Berlin, Belgrade or Petrograd, and just as quickly disappears into thin air. It arose in the mountains of Bosnia amidst the carnage of the Second World War and the bloody fascist civil war within Yugoslavia that accompanied it, and we seized the day. But it did not arise again since. I used to believe that these contradictions were caused by a motor of class struggle, but by the working class forcing capital into retreat in a simple tug of war. But I've come to learn that it is not that simple. Or I should say that it is simpler than that. Capitalism does it all by itself. It creates unemployment and poverty, environmental destruction, wars and fascism, racism and sexism, all those things we reach for when threatened and scared, and before we reach for the only real solution, a solution that is neither obvious nor easy, but nor is it as complicated as pushers of the fetishism of the new make it out to be, a solution that calls for hard work and dedication, for ruthless criticism of everything existing, for sacrificing bravery, organization, discipline, for showing up and sitting through meetings, for doing small things that no one ever notices and that seem pointless, for a struggle by any means necessary and that allows for never turning back, a struggle for universal brotherhood and unity, for abundance for all, for peace and compassion, for socialism.
Wow. We were joined on this edition. Before we close, I just want to thank Ivan for this incredible special edition of 1+1. It's kind of it's an audio documentary. I think this is what it was, an audio documentary on the history of Yugoslavia and reclaiming it from a lot of the, I think, overly simplistic stereotypes that not just the former Yugoslavia, but that Eastern Europe has been reduced by, I think, a lot of the Western left and much of the liberal intelligentsia. So many of the questions, actually, that I even had prepared, which we're going to do in future episodes, you sort of already answered, but we will definitely return to it again. And I'm going to try to get my friends at the Barricade to publish this wonderful history of Yugoslavia that you gave us, the beginning of this once beautiful nation, the sad dissolution of the country, and now post-Yugoslavia, especially with Serbia. And you answered a lot of questions on it. Yes, I'm gonna try to have that published. And for anyone who would like a copy of this brilliant history of Yugoslavia, I'll make sure that they can email me or they can email you. And I got really nothing much more to add, but just to say that, but just to say thank you so much for this, and I'm looking forward to us returning back, returning back to this subject, we are joined on this edition of 1+1, this all things Yugoslavia with our historian Ivan Stoiljkovic, a Yugoslavian immigrant based in Ontario, Canada, who is a bus driver and a violin teacher and a fantastic left-wing activist, part of the People Power movements there. Ivan, anything you want to say before we stop this recording?
No, not really. Thank you for letting me read it again. And it's always emotional going through this, and I always see new things that need to be addressed. So in the future, editions, there will be more about Tito and how he had the biggest funeral in the history of the world, in a sense that it was a funeral attended by the most heads of state in the history of the world. And then, you know, sometimes we say, since Tito died, the whole world went to shit, you know? And it's kind of true.
Very much so.
Anyway. It's true anyway. But yeah, maybe a little more about him. I mean, I covered his early days, but later.
Well, here's hoping. I do a lot of work with. I do a lot of work, and I'm a frequent guest on the Barricade, which is a pan-Eastern European news outlet which covers Eastern European affairs and international affairs, always from a critical perspective. And here's hoping in the future that a new pan-Eastern European left, whose socialism is with Eastern European characteristics, just like the Chinese think that they're trying to build socialism with Chinese characteristics. Here's hoping that makes a huge comeback in Eastern Europe, because I think humanity depends on this, and I think certainly breaking the vicious cycle, the reign of terror of capitalism, sectarianism, and NATO. If that doesn't happen in Eastern Europe, I don't see any I don't see much hope.
It's very depressing. The situation is very discouraging, but I keep remembering that we had a really good thing, and we have an actual example. So we're like far ahead in that sense of the West. You know what I mean? Or many other places, like by West mostly, like in Canada, in Belgium. There's no history of successful socialism, right? Yugoslavia was pretty amazing, and that's the thing. Everyone knows it, so I think it's there for the taking. You know what I mean? People are ready. We have to. It's on us to stop being idiots and try to be so special.
Also, I think it's important for I think leftists such as yourself and others who never ever renounced their communism when the counter revolution took place. We also need to move, not just the new Eastern European left. I would say the global left also needs to move beyond the anti-communist leftism, which is self-McCarthyism, self-red baiting, self-red scare, and I think has only crippled us and has made the movement only impotent. So,
and it's never accomplished anything, ever. Never
exactly.
Had a moment of success. I mean, and like how do you do? I mean, it's supposed to be a science, man. Marxism is supposed to be a science. We're supposed to be testing our politics on the ground. I mean, if you're pushing politics that never accomplished anything, that had zero success, and all it did was wreck and destroy, socialism. I mean, how do you stick to that?
Exactly.
Hundreds of years of failure.
Exactly.
Yeah. No, that's the thing. None of this was perfect, right? I've read it out. Tito did horrible things. Yugoslavia, there was nothing perfect about any of these projects. Of course, they were not perfect, but they were socialist projects. People woke up in the morning not worried about where the bread is coming from, where the rent money is coming from.
Since then, all it has been is barbarism. And again, it's not that there wasn't some barbaric shit that did happen in any of these projects, but the alternative that we've seen, as the Frank Zappa song goes, the torture never stops. There's been nothing but barbarism in not just the former Yugoslavia, but across Eastern Europe, Russia with its century of with its decade, I have to say, its decade of humiliation, but still ongoing inequality. And now, of course, with Ukraine, we just see, all of it boiling up again. But we're going to have to close it here. So we are joined on this edition of 1+1, a people's history of Yugoslavia, from a truly uncompromisingly Marxist Leninist perspective. Is fair to say, or Marxist Yugoslavian?
Yeah. Call me a communist. You can call me a Marxist Leninist.
Marxist communist Yugoslavian perspective with Ivan Stoiljkovic. Ivan, thank you so much. Looking forward to us organizing two more follow-up interviews and discussion on this. But for now, again, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Yuri. Always lovely, amazing to talk to you. Thank you so much. See you